Have you ever heard of Ishmael, Abraham's son who was thrown into the desert and seemingly forgotten? His story is enigmatic and at the same time one of the least known in the Bible. In this video, we're going to explore in depth the fate of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn who faced abandonment but who, through divine providence, became the father of a great nation. Yes, God blessed him too. Let's unravel together how a boy, born into circumstances of doubt and rejection, overcame adversity and became a very important figure in biblical history. If you've ever felt forgotten or rejected, this story can bring answers and inspiration to your life. Discover how God never abandons those who trust in His promises, even in the darkest moments. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any of the biblical productions on this channel. That said, let's get to the story of Ishmael. Imagine a desolate setting, where hope seemed to be just a shadow of the past. Abraham, a man of unshakable faith, had received a divine promise that seemed impossible to human eyes. God assured him that he would be the father of a great nation, a grand promise for someone already advanced in age. However, as the years went by, Abraham began to question whether this promise would really come true. Abraham doubted God's promise for a while. Every day that dawned and every night that fell seemed to bring with it more doubts and fewer answers. And by his side, Sarah, his wife, shared the same feeling of uncertainty. She, now elderly, saw her lifeless womb as a testimony to the fact that the promise seemed increasingly unattainable. Sarah, a woman whose life had been marked by silent frustrations, began to feel the weight of the unfulfilled promise. In the midst of this growing anguish, she made a decision that would change the course of her family's history and that of future generations. In an act of desperation and perhaps resignation, Sarah proposed a solution that seemed practical, albeit disastrous: that Abraham should have a son with Hagar, his Egyptian maidservant. This son, in Sarah's vision, would be the key to fulfilling the promise God had made to Abraham. The idea was daring, and perhaps deep down in her heart, Sarah hoped that this plan would be the answer to the anguish she felt. Hagar, the maidservant, was a young woman full of vigor, a foreigner in lands that were not her own, and now found herself in the midst of a plan much greater than she could imagine. And so, in a setting full of unspoken tensions and loaded glances, Hagar conceived a child by Abraham. When Ishmael was born, the feelings were mixed. There was the joy of the birth of a child, but also a tension that began to form. Ishmael came into the world as Abraham's first son, and with him he brought new hope. As Abraham held the baby in his arms for the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility and the divine promise. Abraham's heart, once filled with doubt, now beat with renewed faith. Ishmael was living proof that God could be fulfilling His promise. However, this was not the son God had promised Abraham. It's important to make that clear. Obviously, problems would arise over time. While Abraham found joy in the birth of Ishmael, tension soon set in. Sarah, who had initially suggested the plan, now saw the fruit of her idea come to life before her eyes, and this began to cause discomfort in her heart. She realized that Ishmael, although Abraham's son, was not the son of God's promise to her. This discomfort planted the seeds of a growing family tension that would only intensify over the years. Thus, Ishmael's birth marked the beginning of a new era for Abraham, but it also set in motion a series of events that would bring challenges and trials to his family. Ishmael, the son born of Hagar, was now a central figure in Abraham's life, and with him, the story of his descendants began to unfold. However, the divine promise still had more to reveal, and Ishmael's life would be only the beginning of a narrative that would intertwine with faith, doubt, and the destiny of an entire nation. Ishmael grew rapidly with the vitality of a young man born in the harsh environment of the desert. He was the pride of his father, Abraham, who saw in the boy the vigor and the promise of a grand future. Hagar, his mother, cared for him with devotion, protecting and guiding him in his early steps in life. From a young age, Ishmael demonstrated strength and skill that set him apart from others, and as the years passed, these qualities only intensified. Abraham, with pride and affection, taught Ishmael everything he knew, preparing him for what he believed would be a brilliant future. But as Ishmael grew in strength and wisdom, something else grew in Sarah's heart, a silent unease that slowly turned into jealousy and fear. The presence of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, who once seemed like the solution to their lack of heirs, now became a thorn in her heart. The boy, though innocent, represented a veiled threat to the future of Isaac, the son Sarah had finally conceived, according to the divine promise. The birth of Isaac brought immense joy to Abraham and Sarah. Finally, the child of the promise had arrived, bringing with him the certainty that God was fulfilling his words. However, at the same time that Sarah rejoiced in the birth of her son, fear began to creep into her thoughts. She watched Ishmael, now a lively young man, and the shadow of doubt grew in her heart. Would Ishmael, as the firstborn, take Isaac's place? Was the future she imagined for her son threatened? These questions echoed incessantly in Sarah's mind, and her unease began to manifest in actions. Every interaction between Ishmael and Isaac seemed charged with tension, even though the boys were innocent of the adults' concerns. Sarah saw in every gesture of Ishmael and every word he spoke a potential risk to the future of her beloved Isaac. And as time passed, this discomfort transformed into an uncompromising decision. The tension finally reached its breaking point. Sarah, unable to bear Ishmael's presence and fearing for Isaac's future, made a drastic decision. She asked Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. For Sarah, this was the only way to ensure that Isaac, the child of the promise, could grow up without Ishmael's shadow looming over him. Her request was not just motivated by jealousy, but by a deep concern for her son's destiny. Abraham, on the other hand, found himself in a painful dilemma. He loved Ishmael, the son he had raised and who carried part of him. The idea of sending Ishmael and Hagar away, leaving them at the mercy of the desert, was agonizing. However, Sarah's insistence and the complex family dynamics pressured him to make a decision. In the midst of his suffering, Abraham prayed to God for guidance. It was then that God, understanding Abraham's dilemma, assured him that Ishmael would also be blessed and that a great nation would come from him. With this promise, Abraham, though reluctant, conceded to Sarah's request. However, the love and concern he felt for Ishmael did not diminish. He prepared Hagar and Ishmael with what he could, and with a heavy heart, sent them away, knowing that their future was in God's hands. Ishmael, now distanced from the home he had always known, and Hagar, with a broken heart, set out into the desert. This painful decision marked the end of a chapter in Ishmael's life, but also the beginning of a journey that would define him and put to the test everything he had learned up to that moment. The conflict between Sarah and Ishmael, born of a mixture of jealousy and fear, had changed the course of their lives forever. However, God's promise remained, and that promise would continue to guide Ishmael and his mother's steps through the desert and beyond. The desert is a relentless place, where the scorching heat of the day and the biting cold of the night challenge even the strongest. For Hagar and Ishmael, that desert became a symbol of loneliness and abandonment. With a heavy heart, Abraham gave them only a simple skin of water and a bit of bread, provisions that seemed insufficient for the arduous journey ahead. Abraham's decision, though painful, was made in the trust that God would care for his son, Ishmael, and Hagar. But for Hagar, the reality was raw and cruel. She was alone with her son in a vast and dangerous desert with no place to go. As mother and son wandered through the desert of Beersheba, the hope they had slowly drained away with the water from the skin. Each drop that fell on Ishmael's parched lips was a reminder of the harsh reality. The desert does not forgive, and they were at the mercy of its mercilessness. The days passed and the relentless sun scorched their skin, while the nights enveloped them in a desperate cold. The strength that once made Ishmael his father's pride now began to wane in the face of hunger and thirst. And Hagar, a desperate mother, found herself powerless, unable to alleviate her son's suffering. When the last drop of water was consumed and the bread was gone, despair overtook Hagar. Seeing no other way out, she made a painful decision. She distanced herself from Ishmael, placing him under a bush, unable to bear the sight of the son she loved so much dying of thirst. The pain she felt at that moment was indescribable, the kind of pain that cuts to the soul. She walked away, feeling completely helpless, and began to weep. But as she cried, something profound was happening. Ishmael's cries rose to the heavens, reaching the ears of God, and then, in the darkest moment of their lives, the miracle happened. The angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar, bringing with him a message of hope. "Do not be afraid," he said, "for God has heard the boy's voice where he lies." These words brought Hagar a new strength, a renewal of hope that she could never have imagined feeling in that place of death. The angel instructed her to lift Ishmael and hold him by the hand, for God would make him the father of a great nation. At that moment, the angel's words were not just a promise. They were a guarantee that the desert would not be the end of Ishmael's story. Suddenly, Hagar's eyes were opened, and before her appeared a well of water. This well, which had seemed non-existent before, was now a source of life, a divine response to her affliction. Hagar ran to the well, filled the skin with water, and gave it to Ishmael. The cold water flowed down the boy's dry throat, bringing him back to the life that had seemed to be slipping away. The desert, which had once symbolized death and abandonment, was now the stage for a miracle. There, in the middle of nowhere, God proved that he was present even in the darkest moments. From that day on, Hagar and Ishmael found the strength to carry on. The desert of Beersheba, which had witnessed their despair, also witnessed their salvation. God not only delivered them from imminent death, but also reaffirmed the promise made to Abraham. Ishmael would be the father of a great nation. This promise was now the foundation upon which Ishmael's future would be built. The desert, with all its harshness, had become a place of encounter with God, and Hagar and Ishmael left it not as ordinary survivors, but as people who had been touched by the Creator himself. In this account, found in Genesis chapter 21 from verse 8 onwards, we see that God is not only the God of Israel, but of all those who believe in him. Remember, Hagar was Egyptian, and Ishmael was not the son of God's promise to Abraham. This chapter in the lives of Ishmael and Hagar was not just a testament to their resilience, but also a demonstration of divine care in the midst of adversity. The solitude of the desert was broken by the presence of God, and Ishmael's destiny, the abandoned son, began to be shaped by his hands. Now, with the promise renewed in their hearts, they were ready to face whatever came, knowing that God was with them, even in the most barren places of life. Ishmael, having survived the ordeal of the desert, emerged from the experience as a young man hardened by life, but also shaped by the divine protection that had saved him in his darkest moment. The desert, which had been a scene of despair, now became Ishmael's home. In the vast and arid desert of Paran, far from cities and the securities others might seek, Ishmael found his place. There, he not only survived but flourished, embracing the freedom of the desert with a strength that seemed innate. Each day that passed, Ishmael honed his skills, becoming particularly adept with the bow and arrow. This weapon, simple yet effective, became an extension of himself, a skill that symbolized his ability to adapt and survive. Life in the desert was harsh, but Ishmael was prepared for the challenges. The endless vastness, with its golden dunes and relentless sandstorms, was the training ground where he became a warrior. The bow Ishmael carried on his back was more than a hunting tool. It was a symbol of his independence, of his ability to provide for himself and others. He became known as a skilled archer, capable of hitting his target with deadly precision. This skill not only provided him with the necessary sustenance, but also earned him respect among those who, like him, lived in the desert. However, Ishmael's life was not marked solely by survival. He also began to build a life of his own, far from his father Abraham's home, but guided by the divine promise that still hovered over him. Ishmael married an Egyptian woman, and through this union, he began to fulfill the destiny that God had promised. From their marriage, 12 sons were born, each becoming a prince, a leader of a tribe. These princes gave rise to a powerful nation that spread across the desert and beyond. The desert of Paran, which might seem inhospitable to many, was the cradle of a great nation. Ishmael, with his resilience and determination, led his family with wisdom and strength. Each tribe that arose from his sons bore the mark of his independence and the harshness of desert life. The difficulties Ishmael faced throughout his life, from rejection in Abraham's house to the struggles to survive in the desert, prepared him to be a leader whom his descendants could admire and follow. Even though Ishmael was born in the sin of not trusting God, he was never beyond the reach of God's promise. God not only saved him in the desert, but also blessed him abundantly, fulfilling his word to make him the father of a great nation. Ishmael's life, although marked by challenges, was one of purpose and fulfillment. He not only survived abandonment and loneliness, but turned these experiences into a solid foundation on which to build a lasting legacy. Ishmael, the desert archer, is an example of how adversity can shape a strong and determined character. He lived and thrived in an environment where few could, guided by faith and the promise that God was with him. The desert, with all its vastness and austerity, was not just a place of survival for Ishmael, but the field where he became the leader of a great nation, fulfilling the destiny that had been laid out for him from the beginning. And so, the bow and arrow he carried were not just weapons, but symbols of his journey and his triumph over the adversities that life imposed on him. Time is a powerful force that shapes lives, heals wounds, and inevitably leads everyone to their final destination. For Ishmael, the passing years drew him further and further away from his father Abraham's house. Life led him down distant paths where he built his own legacy, created a great nation, and established himself as a respected leader in the desert. However, the bond between father and son, though stretched by distance and circumstances, was never completely broken. It was this bond, nourished by divine promise and blood ties, that brought them together one last time. The news of Abraham's death reached Ishmael, bringing with it a mixture of emotions. Abraham, the patriarch, the man of faith who had left everything to follow God's promise, had finally completed his journey on earth. For Ishmael, this news was a call not only to honor his father but also to revisit a part of his own history, a part he had left behind, but that still was part of who he was. With a heavy heart but determined, Ishmael returned to the land of his ancestors, to the land that Abraham had purchased to bury his beloved wife Sarah. The cave of Machpelah, located in Hebron, would be the place where Abraham would rest beside Sarah, in a tomb that symbolized both the end of an era and the continuity of God's promise to his generations. As Ishmael approached the place, he felt the weight of the moment. The land that had once been the scene of so many promises and challenges was now the setting for the final farewell to the man who had been his father. Upon arriving, Ishmael met Isaac, his half-brother, the child of the promise who had caused so much tension and separation in the past. The last time they were together, their world was filled with conflicts and insecurities. Now, both were adult men, marked by different life experiences but united by grief and reverence for the father they had lost. The reunion between Ishmael and Isaac was silent, but loaded with meaning. There was no need for words. The presence of one another already said much about the respect and recognition they had for the bond that, despite everything, united them. Together, Ishmael and Isaac buried Abraham in Machpelah. It was a solemn moment, where past rivalries and resentments were set aside, giving way to a deep reflection on the heritage Abraham had left behind. There, before the tomb, the two brothers, who had followed such different paths, united in a final gesture of honor and respect. The silence that accompanied the burial was filled with the weight of history and the promise that had survived through the generations. This moment was not just a farewell to Abraham, but also a kind of silent reconciliation between the sons. Despite the differences and the distance, Ishmael and Isaac shared something greater: the lineage and the promise of God, which was present both in the tribes that arose from Ishmael and in the descendants of Isaac. The burial of Abraham was, in a way, a point of convergence where the lives that had been separated met again in respect and honor. After the burial, Ishmael returned to the desert, to his life and his people, carrying with him the memory of his father and the weight of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. He had fulfilled his duty as a son, and more than that, had renewed the bond that, though fragile, still existed between him and Isaac. Life would continue its course, but the encounter in Machpelah marked a final chapter of a family story full of challenges and promises. God's promise to Abraham would continue to unfold through the lives and descendants of his two sons, and thus Abraham's legacy would live on, not only in Isaac's tribes, but also in the great nation that Ishmael had founded. Years passed, and Ishmael, Abraham's once-forgotten son, saw God's promise fulfilled in his life in ways he could never have imagined. As he looked at his sons, the 12 princes who each led their own tribes, Ishmael was able to witness the beginnings of a great nation forming, just as God had promised. Each of his sons grew strong, leading his people with wisdom and courage, spreading Ishmael's descendants across vast regions of the Middle East. These tribes not only survived, but thrived, establishing themselves as influential and respected forces in the arid lands and beyond. Many historians claim that the origins of the Arab peoples descend from the Ishmaelites, sons of Ishmael. Ishmael's life, marked by difficulties and challenges from the beginning, culminated in a story of triumph and divine fulfillment. He, who had been sent into the desert with only a skin of water and a piece of bread, now saw his descendants grow in number and power. The desert, which had been his home and training ground, became the stage where his descendants flourished, occupying territories and establishing cultures that would endure for generations. Ishmael's name spread not only through his lineage, but also through the stories and traditions that each tribe carried. Ishmael's legacy is living proof of God's faithfulness. Even when Ishmael was removed from Abraham's household, God never withdrew his promise, made in Genesis chapter 21, verses 17 and 18. He turned the adversities faced by Ishmael into opportunities to shape a strong leader, whose qualities and character would be reflected in his descendants. Each tribe that emerged from his children carried Ishmael's resilience and strength with them, settling in regions that many considered inhospitable, but which for them were lands of opportunity and growth. Though Ishmael's story is often relegated to the background, his life is a powerful testimony to divine care and providence. God not only remembered Ishmael, he blessed him abundantly, fulfilling his promise to make him the father of a great nation. Ishmael's narrative is a reminder that even when men may forget or abandon, God remains faithful to his promises. Ishmael's life, full of twists, challenges, and finally fulfillment, is an example of how God transforms the destiny of those who trust in his word, regardless of circumstances. As the years advanced and Ishmael grew older, he was able to look back with a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. The desert, which had been the scene of so many struggles, was now the home of a powerful nation that continued to grow and prosper. Ishmael, the son whom many thought would be forgotten, had left an indelible mark on history. His name and legacy would live on through his sons and the nations they founded, continuing the story that God had begun with Abraham. At the end of his life, Ishmael became more than just the son of Abraham. He became the patriarch of a powerful nation, a symbol of the fulfilled promise and divine faithfulness. His story is a testimony to God's transformative power, which can take what is rejected and make it a pillar of a great work. Ishmael, the desert archer, the leader of princes, the father of a great nation, is a living reminder that in God's hands, all destinies can be redeemed, and all dreams, no matter how impossible they may seem, can become reality. Write in the comments what lessons you draw from this story. Take all the information in this video and compare it with the information in the Bible. Be a Berean Christian, if you know what I mean. Remember, Ishmael was not the son of promise. He was the fruit of Abraham's sin in not trusting the word of the Lord. But even so, the Lord blessed Ishmael. God is not an exclusivist God. He is God in the life of everyone who believes in his name, no matter where they come from. May the Lord bless your life. See you in the next video.